show where we look at contact tracing technology from around the world. We look at what makes for effective contact tracing and what doesn't. Here's your host, Simon Small.
Into a changing world, and just as there continues to be a lot of different approaches to COVID-19, there are just as many approaches to contact tracing technology. Last week, we took a look at the Bluetooth app provided by the Australian government. In a couple of weeks, they are at over 5 million users. It is blind on location, and it needs a 15-minute period of contact before it will register anything. The US is yet to announce, as is New Zealand. Venture builder and investor Titus joined us from San Francisco last week to say he has 15 different companies looking for funding that solve the contact tracing problem. Tonight, we're going to turn our attention to the UK and Hong Kong. They've got different contact tracing methods underway. And last week, I promised we would drop you into the deep end of contact tracing technology, a bit like the show The Wire. But this week, before we turn to other shores, I want to tell you a little more about who is making this show happen. Let's welcome into Moonshot Studio here in Queenstown, a resident expert who has her home in San Francisco, but has been here for lockdown, Priya Samra. Hey, Priya.
Hi, thanks for having me, Simon. Hi. It's been lovely to be here in your country.
Yeah, well, we're glad that you're here. You've worked in technology for a long time across both business services and the crypto space, and you've also been in public policy with the US Senate. I'm keen to get your thoughts. I just saw a post from a friend of mine who's traveling across America, and he said that he was warning about the end of freedom and linking contact tracing with tactics used by Nazi Germany. You know, like it's the beginning of the end as we know it. Are you picking up these sentiments, and what do you say to these normally rational people who are freaking out about contact tracing technology?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting few weeks. There is a video that has 8 million views from a scientist who's been debunked and cast out of scientific society. And the claims within this video are outrageous, and yet they seem to be, igniting like wildfire. And I think it's related really to how much faithlessness now Americans have in our government because of experiences that they've had in the last 4 years, where we have an administration that just seems to be ignoring what our needs are and shutting down very key parts of our government, and this virus and the pandemic is just a symptom of that, and it seems to be really hitting the fan, if you will, now. And my response is that, we are critical thinking human beings. We have social technology that is allowing us to come up with decisions together. It's really important to share information, that we shouldn't be suppressing anybody's opinion. Everyone has a right to their opinion, but we also need to watch ourselves where misinformation is being pumped into our communities, especially based on somebody's motivation. That the video that has 8 million viewers, there's evidence now that they were reposting it so that it would look more controversial because it kept being taken down. And there's also the debunked scientist at the center of the controversy, who some of the claims that she made are just so ridiculous. Like, she was the first person to study Ebola, and there's evidence that there was a lab that studied Ebola in 1975, like way before she was even a scientist. And so, we just have to kind of look at those types of things and understand that we have information at our fingertips. We have the internet. We can make the right decisions and sound decisions, and to be able to identify real experts. So, it's absolutely normal for us to have concerns, especially about technology, and we should learn from history. Absolutely. Technology only works if we have privacy, and we've seen that time and again. And now's the time to really build tools that can really effectively help our public.
Well, we'll come on to this perhaps later in the episode, but I was talking to John, who I'm going to bring on in a second, about security and privacy, and we've got our government saying you should keep a log. So there's nothing very secure about pen and paper, keeping a log of where you've been. There's no encryption, there's no security. And the other thing is the registers where you go out to a bar or restaurant, like there's just registers of people writing their names, and some are putting their full address. And I saw one at the Hilton, it just said Canada, that was the address. Like keeping a track of where people have been is it's in all sorts of stages all over the world. Okay, so another resident expert who has his home in San Francisco, but has been living here, living all his life between San Francisco and Queenstown, is John Stockdale. Welcome, John.
Hey, Simon. How's it going today? Great to join you again.
Good. You're having a good hair day today.
Lockdown hair has been a situation, but I'm also glad we're all staying safe and in our bubbles. At some point, hopefully I'll be able to go get a haircut.
I've got mine booked in 2 weeks' time. So I'm just going to tell everybody about you, John. So John was at Facebook working on the platform's resiliency when it went through its fastest scaling of all time in a single year. John was also instrumental in creating the exit button at Facebook, also known as download your information. And more recently, he's co-founded a healthcare startup, which aimed to create more of a New Zealand-like healthcare experience in the US. And in the last 6 weeks, he's launched with some others Helping Hands, which is a platform that connects people and those around them to give them the help they need. And Priya's also involved in that. And it's had 20 million Uber rides donated to it, and it's nationwide in the US. So now that I've embarrassed you, John, what's your sense of where we're at with contact tracing this week?
Well, I think my concern continues to be the fact that a lot of this seems to be more of a PR exercise for some of the policymakers involved than actually hard technology being deployed in the way we need to see it. There are some promising developments. I do think that there are solutions that are much better than just a pen and paper that you're carrying around with you and writing a log down manually. I would like to see more electronic solutions, more app-based solutions that actually let you keep a ledger or record of everywhere you've gone as well. But I think that at the end of the day, like I said last week, the best things to do right now to keep you and your family safe are just follow best practices, try to be mindful of always washing your hands, try to do the things that we know work. Masks, for instance, work. If you have a cloth mask or other PPE that you can use, it's going to decrease transmission, especially if you're asymptomatic. And I still remain hopeful that we will see more technological solutions that solve this problem, but without people adapting them widely, without people adopting them widely, they're not going to work any better than hopes and dreams. So at this point, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see some better solutions get released in the coming weeks. And I also think that there are some countries that are definitely ahead of others at the current moment, and hopefully we can call some of those out throughout the show.
Great. All right, well, let's now turn our attention to life in Hong Kong. Thanks to the Global Network, I've been introduced through a friend to someone who flew her family out of the UK to Hong Kong. And she had an unusual experience arriving at the Hong Kong airport. She's an architecture and design writer for the South China Morning Post, the SCMP. Welcome, Suji.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the show. So you're in the same apartment that you were quarantined in when you arrived back from the UK?
House, yes, in the same residence. Yes, and I have to say, it does make a difference if you're in a house with a garden and perhaps a pool. It makes a huge difference. I mean, obviously, the vast majority of Hong Kongers live in tiny blocks of air in the sky, you know, and yeah. I think that's a totally different experience, which I'm afraid can't really help you with.
So you had to get your family out quite quickly from the UK. What was going on in the UK at the time?
Yeah, so this was third week of March. So there was all the chat, obviously, about the UK any minute was imminently going to have some sort of lockdown. And I think we got out as if from a war zone a day before they shut all the restaurants. And in fact, sorry, it was the day of shutting all the restaurants and bars, because we were staying in a hotel about to fly out the following day, and we weren't able to get any food because they weren't allowed to, serve us. So we went hungry for a whole night before we were able to get, out onto an airplane, because shops had shut, restaurants had shut, no takeaways, nothing at all. So that was unusual.
And what happened on your arrival into Hong Kong airport?
Yeah, so it's super efficient, like everything in Hong Kong. Took about 10 minutes to get through this process at the airport, where they put on a band on your arm. It's a bit like the sort of what you would get on registering into a hospital. So plastic with your name on it and your details. And you have to download an app onto your phone, and between the two, they're able to track your whereabouts, supposedly. Although there are all these reports saying that actually perhaps not as foolproof as the design. So yes, when we arrived at home, for example, you get a minute when you sort of start the app going. You get a minute to walk the perimeter of your property. And, so we were sort of dashing to my daughters and I dashing to all areas of my house and garden to make sure we were in. And the idea is that every time you go outside of that boundary, then it'll ping to ask you to send in your coordinates into, I don't know, ground control. And they track you. So they absolutely do track you. We were good and we stayed in the entire time. But friends of ours who perhaps weren't so good at the perimeter initially, they looked like they were going to go outside, and they did have members of the police come over, or some sort of checking body to come over and see what was going on, where they'd been and so on. So yeah, definitely it was definitely a thing, definitely worked in that sense. And what I would add to that is, I can see your horrified faces. What I'd add to that is, don't forget, we already live in a territory of say 7 million people who we already have Hong Kong ID cards. We have ID cards that we have to carry everywhere. So if you like, our security and privacy kind of rights are far less than what you would expect in the UK or in America, say, or in New Zealand. So not that much of a big ask to just then, it's just a tiny little baby step more to have one of those on your arm for 2 weeks and to say, I've been really good for 2 weeks. I can prove it. And I would say, yeah, culturally speaking, we were all fine with it. Hong Kong has been fine with it. There've been no outcries about that. So very easy.
Great. Priya, do you have any questions?
No questions, but wow, it's awesome to hear, from personally from somebody about their experience, because you read about it, but but you're doing great. So that's good to know.
Well, I will say there is a range of experience, and there are those of us who have embraced it and, bake a lot and that kind of thing. And there are others who, if you're living 8 people to a tiny 300 square foot apartment, I don't know how they do that. That's a totally different experience. So and also I've heard anecdotally about people who've been sent to what do you call them? The government quarantine sites, and that's a whole that very basic conditions, sort of sanitary issues, and just likened to being in a prison. So I think everyone prefers to be at home quarantined for 2 weeks rather than somewhere like that.
And so, just out of curiosity, do they allow you out to do any exercise or errands, or is it a strict quarantine where 24 hours a day you need to be within the premises?
Absolutely. So not like you guys where you got to exercise for a day. So the difference being, it was only for 2 weeks. So it's a very doable thing for 2 weeks. No, not allowed. That's what I'm saying about being in an apartment. If you're in an apartment and your only recourse is a jump rope, or it's very different.
That's
we
fascinating.
we played, lawn chair tennis over in the patio. So there was, it's actually very pleasant. It was a lovely family bonding time for 2 weeks. So I cannot complain at all. I don't think that was the case everywhere.
Like I think
I have a question. Why did you want to leave the UK for Hong Kong? What was the reasoning?
Purely personal. Hong Kong is our residential home. So my husband was here, and annoyed at being all by himself. And we were in the UK. We would just finish up my kids' schooling because they go to boarding school there, and they got kicked out of school because all school closed, and so it was time to come home. But we did have to hang around a bit because we couldn't get a flight immediately, with the flight frequencies going down, and everyone trying to get from Hong Kong, from the UK back home to Hong Kong at the same time. Yeah, it was quite tricky getting on flight. So I think we had to wait, I don't know, something like 2 weeks for the next available flight.
Mm-hmm.
You had a QR code on the band, you're telling me. Can you just explain the significance of the QR code and the check-ins that were required as a result?
It's not nice to be branded with any form of number, is it? But the idea was there was a QR code on the band, and then several times during the day, your phone would buzz, insistently. I mean, it really would. Like, there's no way to turn it off or anything except by pressing it to your QR code, and then it would register, yes, you're in the place you're supposed to be, and only then would the buzzing stop. So, I mean, obviously you could, uninstall the app, but otherwise it was a pretty annoying app, I would say. I mean, because it was not a regular time. It would go off in the morning or in the evening several times, probably, I don't know, up to 10, maybe 15 times a day. So yeah, it was definitely just annoyed you into staying in, I think, more than anything else. There were news reports of people who were spotted out and about, in the supermarket wearing their bands, which is a bit of a rookie error. But they were wearing their bands with their trolleys, and someone took a photo. It went all over social media. So, and in their own way, I think they got lynched. They were taken care of. But the idea being that it's not like it can track and trace you immediately. There's a ping, I guess, that goes around. I mean, you'll know more about the technology side, but it goes around periodically. And if you're not in the place you're supposed to be during the ping broadcast, then that's when they would come and find out why. But, I would definitely say that it sounds quite sinister when I put it like that. But what happens to a neighbour of mine is a couple of young chaps come by, very happy and smiling, and, pop round for tea and just make sure that everything's all right. And it's a very low key actual sort of exposure that you get to it, even though, yes, you are wearing a number and a QR code, and the thing does go off all the time. But it was very manageable, especially for 2 weeks. We're not like in the UK. But, sorry,
it sounds like there's also electronics built into the band, or was it just basically the QR code?
So I think there are now. So we got the second generation one. So I think when we arrived back, it was about a week after they'd started doing the home quarantine. And I heard that the first generation ones were just awful because they were paper and just fell apart. So the moment someone had a shower, they just fell apart. We got second generation ones, and I will admit that we slipped them off as quickly as possible and placed them in a central area in the house so that we could do the codes, because we weren't ever going that far from them. And I didn't see, as we were not going to leave the house, so I didn't see the necessity of actually having it on our arms all the time. Yes, so I think there was probably nothing more. There's no radio frequency or any transmitter type thing in there. No. But there was something metallic. I wish I kept it now. There was something metallic in there. So there was something additional to the QR code, but I don't know what that would have been.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But you also had a QR code that came off.
Was
right?
it?
Sorry?
You had a QR code that came off, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes. Well remembered. So my daughters and I, we did it all. We registered all of our QR codes onto the same phone, onto my phone, because my kids don't really use their phones. They never know where they are and so on. So it was just easier, I thought, to have it all on my phone. In fact, it turned out to be a massive pain in the neck because, you know, the beeping for 3 times the people was a lot of beeping during the day. What happened was, so mine would upload straight away. One of my daughters also uploaded. I don't know if that's a word, but it read it pretty quickly. But the third one, my other daughter, I guess the first time she went into the shower or washed hands or whatever, the QR code came off. So actually, we were never able to read hers throughout. So it would beep for her, and we'd be like, "Sorry, can't do anything about that." And nothing was. I did make a call to the hotline about it, and they got back to me and said, "Nah, don't worry about it. We can see that you're fine." So I'm not sure how they could. I mean, you know what? My understanding is, I don't know how many people you would need to really support a contact and trace of that of what they were looking like they were doing. So I highly doubt that was going on, but certainly they gave the impression that was happening. I've lost you.
Everyone's pausing now to not ask questions at the same time. But well, thank you so much. I mean, this is kind of amazing. Was there any kind of concern now with, I know that there was a ton of protests going on in Hong Kong, and then, you know, but this is run by the local government, correct? So was there any kind of concerns about privacy or watching people or tracking people who may have been involved in the protests or anything like that?
So I think the protests are a whole different bag of issues, and I'm sure that we'll see a lot more of that happening when the coronavirus dies down a lot more. The privacy thing, you know, it's going back to what I was saying about, we're kind of used to that lack of privacy. Yeah, we really are. I mean, like, in fact, in Hong Kong, we're just in the middle of going from our old Hong Kong IDs, and they're being upgraded to our new Hong Kong IDs. And already that should make you feel suspicious. The new ones, obviously, you know, the old ones are, 10 years old, so they must be falling apart. But the new ones actually do have something that transmits radio frequency. So I don't know why that would be necessary. I don't think anyone knows why it would be necessary, but that function definitely exists inside the card. So, you know, we're not dealing with the same sort of ballpark as you guys are in the States, in the UK, you know, in New Zealand. By the way, you know, we're in China. It's a whole different privacy situation. I don't think you can compare like for like at all. So yes, there are concerns, to answer your question, but I don't think they're of the same sort of volume as you would get from a bystander in say the US.
Okay, we're
That's
gonna
really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Suji. We're just going to bring this slide in and look at the efficacy and the privacy model that we've used for the other territories. You got that there, thanks. So on a privacy perspective, what would you say from a sort of a low, medium, or high, Priya and John? How would you rate the Hong Kong?
I mean, it seems like an interesting case where like they've done quite effectively on efficacy, but the trade-off is privacy. And the fact that, as Suji pointed out, like that's not necessarily an expectation of the society as it stands today. That's kind of in line with what we saw coming out of China too. The Chinese system generally is considered quite intrusive as far as like everyone has to scan a QR code everywhere they go. But it works, right? So I think for the Hong Kong contact tracing, we're going to go with something similar, like lower on the privacy scale, but in turn, very high on the efficacy scale. It sounds like people are being tracked quite diligently, and anytime people are leaving, even for the supermarket, they know, which for an effective quarantine is something that's really important. It does obviously raise some questions that in America or in New Zealand, we have to figure out the right balance and respect like the status quo as far as civil liberties go. But I do think it's a really good illustration of that trade-off that like low privacy may enable higher efficacy, basically.
Right. And
yeah, it's kind of impressive that they're doing something. Sorry, go ahead.
And this was back in March. This is like 6 weeks ago, right, Suji?
Yeah, this was so 22nd of March I came back. It's been 7 weeks. And I would say also in that time, I think the last 3 weeks now, we've been at 0 domestic transmissions. So anything coming in has been imported. And I think even with that, we're averaging 0 at the moment. Wow. There might have been 3 yesterday, and that's like the biggest number we've had for some time. So
that's awesome. There
is very much the idea that if it's working, it's worth it.
Okay, and on technology, what would you guys say, Priya and John? Low, medium, or high?
I still am kind of trying to figure out what's in that band, because depending on what the metallic thing that Suji mentioned, we're going to go with medium or high. Let's say medium for right now. I'm curious if the band has Bluetooth Low Energy or other chipsets in it that are monitoring things as well. But definitely an interesting approach that I think is probably, I'm going to say medium high on the technology side of things. It's one of the more complete solutions that I've heard of. It is definitely higher on the Big Brother meter, I guess what we'll call it, than I think we could get away with here in New Zealand or back in California. But again, everyone has to make their own trade-off, and in this particular case, efficacy is something that's kind of hard to argue with in a society that accepts that level of, intrusiveness.
Okay, and
it seems like they're using separate sets of data too. So like the bands working with the phone and the QR code. So the 3 working together maybe are a way to triangulate information, which means it's pretty efficacious. But yes, I agree with like not very much privacy and maybe it's not even that high level of technology. A lot of passports now have chips within them as well as a way to track location. And so I'm imagining that it's maybe closer to that end of things.
And I think if the 4th dimension of that technology is the people arriving at your door if you haven't tuned in, which means that it's not security theater, it's actually real. Location is high, so they are picking up location. Simplicity, it sounds like it was pretty simple. We give that a high. And interoperability, we don't really know about that, right? But
it sounds like interoperability is actually probably pretty low, because you have to have one of these bands, you have to have the app. It isn't using contact tracing for the rest of the country, so it does seem like there's a trade-off there of low interoperability for high assurance of location, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so thank you so much, Suji. We are going to now turn our attention to another part of the world. And about a week ago, just as we put our first show out about contact tracing technology, the UK announced conveniently that it would be releasing a contact tracing technology app on the Isle of Wight the next day. We found just the man to tell us all about it. Now Jason Wilby, who co-founded the Mountain Club here in Queenstown, which is where we're based, he said, my mum and dad live on the Isle of Wight, but my mum's camera shy. So welcome to Gerald Wilby. I hear you are handy with the tools. What sort of work have you been doing in your time, Gerald? We've lost Gerald. Have we lost Gerald? I think we have. That was convenient.
Technology.
Maybe that's the contact tracing technology not working. I want to say that it is impressive that in Hong Kong they've brought the cases down to 0, considering it's so close to a hotspot. That's really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the only reason why everyone sort of bent over backwards to help, because I think, there he is.
Hi, Gerald. Can you hear us, Gerald? Can you hear us okay, Gerald?
We've got a very bad connection. I've kind of followed most of it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Perhaps we just switch into you, Ryan.
Oh, but I can't really hear you very clearly.
So tell me, Gerald, how long have you been on the Isle of Wight, and what sort of work have you been doing there?
I moved to Isle of Wight in 1972, so I've been here quite a while. I say I can't really hear what you're saying very well.
Oh, okay.
But I can explain what we're doing here on the island.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The NHS are developing an app. They've tested it in an RAF base initially, opening the test up to us on the Isle of Wight. We have a population of about 120,000. And as of this morning, I read a report in the local press that something like 50,000 have downloaded the app. But the app doesn't actually trace where those downloads are in the UK. So they might not all be on the Isle of Wight, because the app is available through the app stores for both Android and Apple.
And why do you think they chose the Isle of Wight? Can you hear that, Gerald? Why do
I can't hear you, Simon, I'm afraid.
Well, if you just click on the private chat on the right of the screen, you might
get that question.
I will. Can you see the right of the screen that says a private chat? And I'll just put the question in there. Why did the NHS choose the Isle of Wight, do you think? Why do you think?
I can't get anything.
Oh, you can't. What about if I text you on your phone?
Technical difficulties are always, well, technology sometimes works, sometimes
It
doesn't.
looks like the internet might be running slow.
I don't want to go on record
this
saying this, but in the UK, we have jokes about the technology, available in the Isle. So it was an interesting choice.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on from Gerald's broadcast. If he comes back on, we can chat with him. But I think the interesting thing is that the Isle of Wight has a large elderly community, and it's kind of that's what Gerald told me was the main reason for that he believed that they were using it, and it seemed to have a very high pickup amongst that community of people that wanted to try the app. And in the last week, they'd had 3 or 4 cases that had actually been used for contact tracing. So can you hear us any better now, Gerald? No, I don't think you can.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
I can't hear anybody.
Oh dear. Okay. Gerald, we might have to leave it there for today.
I got the question. Why did they choose the Isle of Wight? Is that the question you want answering?
Yes.
Can you put your thumb up if that's the question and you can hear? The reason they chose the Isle of Wight was because we have only mainland, and obviously during lockdown they only allowed essential travel and Isle of Wight residents to use the foot passenger ferries. We eventually were stopped. There's various ways of getting to the Isle of Wight. There's 2 high-speed links, one ride to Portsmouth and one Cowes to Southampton. Those were then taken off. The only foot passenger ferry service now is the Isle of Wight hovercraft, which flies from Ryde to Southsea. The car ferries, one takes 45 minutes and one takes an hour. So foot passengers, essential travellers, commuters that are from the Royal Yards in Portsmouth, etc., have to now travel by ferry. And vehicles are kind of vetted as to whether there is essential travel. And the ferries are only taking freight to supply supermarkets, etc., supermarkets, pharmacies, and essential services. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and how has it been received by the people on the island?
So initially, when it was first suggested that the Isle of Wight was going to be used, the younger people were up in arms. We're being used as gigs, but it seems to have been taken up quite well. So the information I had this morning was 55 at 120,000 population have downloaded the app. I say the only problem they have.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Doesn't matter.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. I think, Ryan, we might just take Gerald out there while we sort out any difficulties, and we might see if we can connect with him on another broadcast. So we're talking about a Bluetooth tracing app developed by a third-party development house contracted by the NHS, rolled out in the Isle of Wight. Interestingly, the Isle of Wight has got, compared to Stewart Island, you could fit 4.5 Isle of Wights into Stewart Island. And if you took Stewart Island's population, this is the island at the bottom of New Zealand, it would be 345 times the population on the Isle of Wight as there is on Stewart Island. So just a little bit of a contrast there. So John, any thoughts on the technology behind this, and the path that the NHS have gone down, and what that sort of suggests for future rollouts there?
I think we still have quite a few questions to ask and answer there, but the one thing that I think is important to kind of consider is a lot of the assumptions we make about technology, just like in this video call, trying to get it working. It was working fine when we tested beforehand, but right now with Gerald, we clearly lost him and had issues with both ways. A lot of the contact tracing solutions that we're looking at, they have similar questions as to efficacy in different situations. Bluetooth in particular is a great example of a technology that in a low noise environment without that many devices. So if you're just going for a run on your own and you have your AirPods in your ears, it's going to work pretty well, right? But already there's a lot of reports out there in the wild of different types of interference, issues with headphones working at the same time as the contact tracing app. Basically, think of that same type of situation where now you're not just having 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 devices that are trying to contact trace or identify each other. But what if you're in a room of, let's say, well, once we get out of level 3 or level 2, let's say you're in a room of 100 people, right? There are a lot of uncertainties about exactly how that's going to work, whether the devices will see each other, whether devices are going to interfere with each other in a way that makes it less possible for them to actually recognize the contact tracing ping, basically every 15 seconds or however it's programmed in the device. And I think that's the thing that is the biggest concern and the biggest question to me about some of these technological solutions. even when you have best practices around how you're deploying a wireless system. So the example I'll give, just to kind of do a comparison, when we were developing a Wi-Fi based RFID check-in system for a Facebook developer conference back in 2012, we had a situation where we tested everything. We got it working basically perfectly before the conference opened its doors. And then the thing that we didn't really account for was the fact that as soon as there were several thousand attendees all in the same area, the Wi-Fi from their individual phones started interfering with the network that we were using to do check-ins. So I think that's the sort of like unintended consequences that we kind of have to look through and figure out. In particular, no one's really deployed a Bluetooth network except for Singapore that's in a high density region, and the current jury is still out on whether Singapore's actually works. So I think that a bunch of these solutions, whether it be in the Isle of Wight, I do in particular call them out for having a good premonition around using Bluetooth there is probably better than using, let's say, 3G or whatever other cell phone signals, because it looks like connectivity is probably not quite as good as the rest of England. And as Suji called out earlier, England or the UK's approach to technology is often a little bit behind the times anyway. So I think those are the things that we have to kind of look at and answer the biggest questions about, because if a contact tracing solution works when there are very few interactions between people, but doesn't work as we ramp it up, then it actually becomes less effective as everyone gets it. And that's something that I'm scared about in particular, because when looking at going from, say, New Zealand's level 4 to level 3 to level 2 lockdown plan, we want to make sure that as more people are congregating, the contact tracing solution is more effective, not less effective.
Great point. Great points. Priya, what would you say about what you've sort of seen about the UK and its efficacy?
Sure. It's actually kind of interesting because they're combining all of these apps through the Bluetooth with many different phone calls. And so there's still a manual part of this that is intriguing to me. And the UK, I mean, it's very populated and people move around a lot, and they need to keep track of it because they also have an elderly population. So I'd be curious to see how the two will work together. As John said, there's going to be failures across the board, and I'm not sure if just making phone calls to people and asking like, "Hey, are you doing okay? Are you well?" Is going to be as effective as just testing people and identifying clusters through that method. So I'd be really curious to see how it'll work out for them.
Yeah, well, I heard something today that it was in the Telegraph that there's a lot of pressure from, I think, Europe and other countries for the NHS to be on a Bluetooth base, the same as the Apple-Google collaboration, and that they may be in the background, even though they've just launched this app, rebuilding it on that system so that it can be more interoperable, so that people can travel internationally. So I don't know if we're fast emerging into kind of this Apple-Google collaboration that's going to be a requirement for international travel. I kind of come back to where we are in New Zealand with people having to write down on a piece of paper where a bar they go into, or a restaurant they go in, or they're not allowed to go to a coffee shop or an outlet, or use a contact tracing check-in system, and there's not really any security on those pieces of paper, and we're being encouraged to fill out diaries of where we've been, and there's no security on those either. So you know, we're in a really interesting stage before anything gets announced in New Zealand, with all sorts of experiments going on. So look, thanks Suji in Hong Kong and Gerald in the Isle of Wight. Thanks Priya. Thanks John. Any final thoughts from both of you before we wrap?
I mean, I will chime in, and I want to call it again. Thank you so much, Suji, for joining us. And in particular, hearing the solutions that are quite tech forward in Hong Kong really is kind of an interesting contrast to some of the ways that we're seeing solutions, I'm going to use quotes, deployed right now in New Zealand. And I agree that the kind of disconnect that I'm seeing here is there's a lot of concern about technology when it's in your phone. And there's a lot of concern about making sure that all of the contact tracing solutions even are kept on your phone locally and not uploaded to a server, which I don't know. I have mixed feelings. If the server is secured well with encryption, if the server is not being used for other purposes, then if I lose my phone, I don't necessarily want to lose my entire history of contacts, right? So there's mixed signals being sent here. And I think the biggest thing is the systems that we deploy have to preserve privacy, but at the same time, they need to be effective systems. And right now, I'm feeling like if you're going to have security theater, which is kind of the opposite of the Hong Kong system, like they're at least doing real security, which I respect. If you're gonna have security theater, then you can't have a piece of paper at every guest establishment. You can't have a guest ledger that you can literally take a photo and snap a picture of. Like, it's kind of absurd that we're saying, okay, if we're going to deploy a solution nationwide to 5 million New Zealanders, we're not going to let you opt in to sharing whether you've been into a particular establishment or not. And yet, if you go into that establishment, you can literally flip through a few pages and see everyone that's been there at least that day and maybe the last few days. So I think maybe resetting our expectations around what is appropriate practices is going to be a good conversation to have. We still want to protect our privacy. We still want a secure system, but we don't want a secure system that trades off fake security or fake privacy. And right now, the guest ledger system is sort of a little bit more PR than actually security, right?
Absolutely. Thanks for that, John. Totally agree. Priya?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like such a manual process is going to necessarily let us understand how people are moving about and whether or not clusters could develop. I mean, in Sweden, they had banned any visits to nursing homes, and yet the virus found its way in, even though the people who were working there were isolating themselves. So this is, we'll see how it pans out in New Zealand. I definitely think that they moved quickly enough in the first place, and perhaps this won't be as much of an issue, going forward. But at the same time, we are a very social creature, and we need to be out and about and trading value and eating out and doing all these things. And I think everyone's just so ready to get into that I would be concerned that people would not be actually very careful about tracking where they're going. And then on top of that, I don't really see anybody, not that many people are wearing masks. And I wonder if there needs to be more of an educational behavioral change that has to also come from this virus that says, okay, well, if you're out, don't touch your face and wash your hands and consider wearing a mask because it protects everyone around you. And let's see what ends up happening here in New Zealand. I'm really excited to get out at least. So I hope people are being super duper careful. But I also am not going to take any risks, and we have not taken any risks with our health so far.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Just before we wrap, I'm just going to ask Suji to come back in. Ryan, thank you. And Suji, thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
Just one question. How would you feel about the NHS app, having lived in both countries and experienced the Hong Kong experience? How would you feel about that NHS
so
app?
I'm vehemently opposed to it, personally. So it's funny, different horses, hey, in different fields. In Hong Kong, it's a mandatory way of life. You've decided to move here and work here, and so you'll accept their ID lack of privacy with the Hong Kong ID that you get. But in the UK, we don't have that, and I don't want that. So I think one of the best ways that they've done the contact tracing here is not been about the individuals. It's been about the places where it's been location tied. So we actually get quite a lot of data saying, oh, a case has come up in this building, in this specific building.
Yeah.
We don't get information such as it was, you know, a male in their 20s who likes to go to this bar. We don't get anything like that. We just get, it was in this place. You know, do you go near this place? And then it's up to you to figure out, like, you know, so you get to plug in that way around rather than, I think at the very extreme of the scale, you will have a situation where we'll end up, like someone said last week, you know, broadcasting like a red signal. I have the virus, or I've had the virus, and I just don't know whether that is a situation I'd be comfortable with in the UK. Very different, you know. So you accept it here because it's temporary and it's alien and foreign for a little while, but home, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's really smart. The location-based approach, looking for clusters, trying to figure out where people could have been exposed, rather than just looking at individuals moving or interfacing with other individuals. That does seem to be like advantageous, because I mean, even if you cough or contaminate a surface, you could get COVID even if you're not there at the same time as someone who's infected.
Well, actually, one of the biggest news stories about a COVID breakout in Hong Kong, one of the first, everyone freaked out because apparently it came from a door handle. It was a door handle in an office. They traced it to. And the thing about it was that it was like in a very sort of deep indoors, you know, there was no sunlight or something like that. It was an area where it could just sit there for days, the virus, I mean, and be undisturbed, except for passing it around, you know. So that's when I think suddenly got a massive mask take up and the frantic washing of hands started happening as soon as we heard that story. So I think it came at a good time, hey, for Hong Kong, because if we hadn't had that story, I think we might not have had the sort of successful outcome that we've had here.
Well, it's interesting just to look at that diagram showing the privacy is low, but the efficacy is high. 1 is low, 3 is high, technology in the middle, location high, simplicity high, interoperability low. They're the highest scores over, you know, the Australian and probably the UK, and probably what's going to get announced in New Zealand. There's quite a long way to go. If something's location, what's that?
What are the scores out of? Is it just 1 to 3? Is it, what's
1 to 3?
What's the highest?
Low, medium, and high.
Oh, just low, medium, high. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next week. And please, if you're watching this, whatever stream that you're watching it on, let us know what you think in the comments section. Would you go for the Hong Kong wristband? Would you be happy using the NHS app? Next week, we're going to update on the US and also start looking at New Zealand's solution. Good night.
Oh, yeah.
Just do a remember on that.